Good morning. My name is David Glick, and Yash asked me to share for about the next 30 minutes on the topic of rest. And so what I want to do is I want to actually frame the topic of rest in the concept of Sabbath, or the idea of a period of rest, or a 24-hour period of rest in the scriptures. And then, because this is a Bible school, I want to do a brief biblical theology of the topic of Sabbath. And so, just to trace the theme from the beginning of the scriptures all the way to the end, and take a few looks at how it develops along the way. And we only have 30 minutes, so it'll be a really brief overview, but that's my hope. And I don't want to actually keep us at a biblical theology. I also want to make it practical for us. And I understand that you've been given some time on Sunday, is that right? Where you're supposed to go and practice this in some way, so that's good. I want to make sure that we take it into practice as well. And in the interest of that, I'll share a little bit about my own life and my practice of this. So, and I'll tip my hand at the beginning here. I do hope to convince at least a few of you that practicing some kind of weekly rhythm of rest is a good idea, and is even scriptural, or at least make you intrigued about the idea of what that could look like. So I've been practicing a weekly day of rest for 8 years, and it has really changed my life. It absolutely has changed my life. I'm a more disciplined person because of it. I think I live closer to Jesus because of it. And so I don't share about this very much. It's a little bit like fasting. Maybe if somebody asks you about it, you'll say, okay, I do fast, and yes, I'm fasting today. But in the manner of Jesus, we don't go out and proclaim on the streets that I'm fasting and I'm doing all of these things. So I don't usually share about it very much, but if somebody asks, I'm happy to share, and Yash asked today, so I'm happy to share my practices with you. And the reason I don't share about it is because I don't necessarily think it's a commandment for Christians. I think it's a little bit of an add-on, and so I'm passionate about it, but I don't usually share a lot. So a little bit more about me. I am from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I was born and raised in an Amish family there, oldest of 7 children. And most of my family is still Amish. And so actually my youngest brother, Marcus, is visiting here today. He's sitting in the back. And so you can say, hello, Marcus. And so the land of dairy cows and shoe fly pies, neither one of which are really available in Boston. So it's a different world. But then I left there at age 25, and I moved to Greece, where I lived for 4 years and worked in a refugee camp. And it was actually during that period that I started practicing a weekly day of rest. And then moved back to the States in 2019, came here to school in 2020 as a history student at Sattler. And then after I graduated, came back to work at Sattler, where I work now. So I've lived here for 5 years. So that's a little bit about me. Let's get into the text. So if you were to trace the theme of rest or Sabbath through the Bible chronologically, where might you start? What would be your first text? Okay. Yeah, correct. End of Genesis 1, start of Genesis 2. And so this is the beginning of Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and the earth and all of hosts of them were finished. And on the 7th day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So this text is very familiar to us, but I think there's actually more here than meets the eye, and I guess I would frame it in this question of, so God rested at the end of 6 days. Why? Why does the creator of the universe rest? Is he tired? Is he exhausted from 6 days of labor? Is it that he ran out of materials like a construction worker who planned poorly, and so you just take a break on the job site? Is it that? And of course, it's none of those things. God is not exhaustible. He's an infinite force of energy. And he doesn't run out of materials. God can create infinitely, and he does create infinitely. So why does he rest? And I think the clue is actually in the words that come right before this. What does God say when he finishes his creation and he looks at it? It is good. It is good. That seems really important to me. This is a God who not only creates beautiful things, he also knows how to enjoy his creation. And even more than that, he knows when to stop creating. I think that's a really powerful point. He's a God not only who creates, he knows when to stop creating. So it says here, the heavens and the earth, they were finished. So God cannot be exhausted, but he does stop. He finishes, he rests, he says, it is good. It is good enough. It is enough. Part of what the Sabbath practice did for the Jewish people is it taught them to trust in the Creator. Think about the story of the manna in the wilderness. Think about how it came for 6 days, came from the heavens, and on the seventh day, none came. Do you think it took no trust at all if you're a Jewish man who has a family to feed and you're in the middle of the wilderness, there's no other food anywhere? Do you think it took no trust to not get extra on the days when it was available, to actually trust that there would be enough for the seventh day? I think it took a lot of trust. And I think we actually see that in the story, right? Some of the people don't trust. They collect extra and they store it, even though God says not to. And it gets wormy, and it's a lesson for them. A lot of the Sabbath is about learning to trust in the goodness of God, learning how to say, actually, it's enough. There's not a week that goes by that when I start my week, my day of rest on the Saturday afternoon, that it doesn't take some trust to do that. There's always more food that could be made, or a corner of the house that didn't get cleaned, or sometimes even work at my job that feels urgent and I should have got done and I didn't. And it actually takes some trust to lay that aside and to say, you know what? It's good enough. I'll come back to it Monday. It'll be good enough. We serve a God who knows how to say, it's good enough. And I think this is just the fact of life, of if you live as disciples of Jesus, if you live as people who are on mission for the kingdom of God, you will probably have a full life. You will probably have lots of really good, meaningful things to do with your life. There are always lots of people who aren't saved. There are always widows that could be visited and taken a casserole and who need somebody to ask about their day. There are so many children in the world waiting to be adopted in children's homes without families. That stuff keeps me up at night. Does it not keep you up at night? We serve a God who knows when to say, it's good enough. And even though there's all these things that can trouble our hearts, and they do trouble God's heart, that we can say, we can rest. And what we've done is good, and we can get back to it on Monday. Okay, so the Sabbath in the law, this is from the Ten Commandments, the fourth commandment to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. And so we see this pattern through Exodus, through Leviticus, through Numbers, through Deuteronomy, of the Sabbath increasingly becoming a part of the Jewish life and increasingly becoming a part of the commands that God gives to them. And then it gets fleshed out more and more what that looks like. And I guess here I want to make a point, which is I don't actually believe that we're commanded to observe the Sabbath. I don't even believe we're commanded to take a 24-hour period of rest. I don't believe that the Ten Commandments are in effect for us anymore, just like the rest of the Jewish law is not in effect for us anymore. And actually, you will have some arguments about this amongst Christians of, are the Ten Commandments still a thing for us? And I think it's a little tricky. I've given away what I believe, but a good question to somebody who does is, well, do you keep the Sabbath? And if so, and most people don't, which I think then calls into question, well, then what do you really believe about the Ten Commandments and whether they're still in effect? So it's a tricky place, but I don't believe that we're commanded to do it. But I think it's worth asking, just because we're not commanded anymore to do it, because we're under the new covenant and not the old covenant, does that mean we shouldn't do it? Does that mean that the principle behind the law is gone, that it's not a thing for us anymore? I think that's a question worth asking. And you can look at some of the rest of the Ten Commandments and ask that same question of, you shall have no other gods before me, honor your father and your mother, do not kill, do not commit adultery, and ask some of the same questions of, is the principle still there? I think, of course, it is. So we can ask that question about the Sabbath as well. Do we really want to disregard it just because there's no law? I just think it's really important to make a difference between what is law and then the principle behind the law, and to recognize that some of those principles still live for us. Okay, so the Jews keep the Sabbath more or less faithfully through their period in the wilderness and then in the land of Canaan. If you come to the prophets in the Old Testament, it looks like less faithfully, but they keep it to some degree through the story of the Old Testament. And then we come to Jesus. And so this is from Mark's Gospel, and this is the story of Jesus and his disciples picking grain on the Sabbath. They went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" He explains the story of David and the showbread from the Old Testament, and then he says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." And so what does Jesus do with the Sabbath? He reinterprets it. Jesus is a Jewish man living in Galilee. His disciples are Jewish men living in Galilee. I think they probably kept the Sabbath faithfully. But Jesus does not keep it the way the Jewish leaders intend for him to keep it. He does what he does with so many of the Old Testament laws. He says, what is the heart of this? What is the real meaning behind it? And so he reinterprets the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's intended to serve the people. It's intended to be a place of rest for them. It's intended to be a reminder of the goodness of God and the things that he has done for them and the things that he will do for them. And instead, Jesus says, you, the Jewish leaders, you've taken this and you've completely lost the heart. And the way that you use it now, it's crushing people. Matthew, in his gospel, he puts this at the beginning of chapter 12. Does anybody know how chapter 11 ends? So chapter 12 has this story. Disciples, Jesus walking through the grain fields, picking grain on the Sabbath. Chapter 11 ends with those famous words, "Come, all ye who labor and are heavy laden. Come, learn from me. Take my yoke upon you, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and I will give you" what? Rest for your souls. There's nothing else for me that is as stark a reminder of the gentleness and the lowliness and the goodness of Jesus than keeping a rest day. It is always, almost without fail, the most joyful time of the week for me. Time when I feel like I can really come to Jesus and just rest and rejoice in him and remember his goodness. And I can feel his love for me in the provision of that day and the goodness of it, that I can rest from my labors. The Sabbath is a time of joy. Okay, and then the last biblical text. So this is from Hebrews. in chapter 4. He says, he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this place, they shall not enter my rest. And then he talks about some of those must enter it. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And then, for if Joshua had given them rest, he would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. And some translations say a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. Now, is this talking about the Jewish Sabbath? Not exactly. It is talking about that, but like Jesus, it's reinterpreting it. And so it is talking about it because it says the seventh day, and it mentions that explicitly. But the early church did not, by and large, keep the Sabbath. Instead, they kept what they called a spiritual Sabbath. And in all the early church writings that I've read, this is almost the case throughout. They reinterpreted the Sabbath, and they started keeping what they called the Lord's Day on the Sunday, specifically celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. And they called the Sabbath a spiritual Sabbath. And more than that, they interpreted backwards into the Old Testament. And so you see the writer of Hebrews doing this here. He says, if Joshua had given them rest, he would not afterward have spoken of another day. And so what's he saying? He's saying this Lord's Day that we are celebrating now, and the person of Jesus in that, and his death and his resurrection, we can actually see the signs of that back in the Sabbath that was kept in the Old Testament. And they do this with so many things, but they do it with the Sabbath. Of now that we've seen Jesus, now that his incarnation, his death, and his resurrection, we have those stories. We actually start to read the Old Testament differently. And so they start talking about a spiritual Sabbath. There remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. And so I think it's worth saying, if that's the case, and if Sabbath is no longer a command for us, why do I keep a weekly rest day? And if our rest is in Jesus, and that's our spiritual Sabbath, resting in his death and his resurrection and his love for us, why keep a rest day? And I think it's actually because of this. I think it's because it's a sign of the age to come. That's why I do it. It's a foretaste of the rest that's mentioned in Hebrews, and that will be full and complete for us on that second Lord's Day, the day of the coming of the Lord, when we'll be taken up with him, and we will truly have rest. And so the new covenant leaves you free not to practice the Sabbath, not to practice a weekly rest day. Paul is really clear about that. But he's also really clear it leaves you free to practice it if you want to. Let each keep his own day. You can practice it if you want to. Okay, to close, some common objections for this practice. One is the one that I mentioned in the early church of, okay, the Sabbath is now sort of replaced by the Lord's Day, and now we keep a spiritual Sabbath, and so the law isn't there for us anymore. And to that I would say, does that mean that you shouldn't rest? Does that mean if you keep the Lord's Day, and I hope you do, if you're honest with yourself, do you keep it as a time of rest? Is it about rest for you? Is it restful? What about a spiritual rest have we taken to mean that it doesn't actually need to be rest? It's really easy to abuse our freedom here. And for it's a spiritual rest, I can rest in Jesus, to turn into, because of Jesus, I don't actually need to rest anymore. As if the movement from the old covenant to the new covenant has suddenly turned us into superhumans who don't actually need to rest, who can just be machines and work all the time. So I think this one has some danger to it. Don't fool yourself. The second, I don't have time to take a Sabbath, to which I would say, what if you don't have time not to take a Sabbath? I actually think that I don't have a way to measure this, but I think taking a weekly rest day makes me more effective in my work and not less. I have a really full life. It's actually more full than I idealize. It's more full than I want it to be. I have to work a couple of evenings a week in order to take a rest day. But I do it anyway, and it helps keep my life ordered, and it helps me to work from a place of rest and not from overwork. The third, rest equals laziness. People don't usually say this aloud, but I think it's worth a little self-examination and just ask, is this there in my mind? Like in some way, do I believe this? And if so, who told you that? Was it your family? Was it your culture? Biblically speaking, rest does not equal laziness. Okay, and then work is more spiritual than rest. This is sort of connected to the rest equals laziness. And again, I would say, who told you that? The biblical life is one that has a rhythm of work and rest. And the scriptures assume that it's good for God's people to do both. And so biblically speaking, one is not more important than the other. Okay, and then to close, here's a few practical tips if you're one of the people who is actually interested in giving this a try. First, rest as you can and not as you can't. And so what this means is just, what is your life? Rest according to what it is. Are you single? Are you married? Do you live in the city? Do you live in the country? Are you introverted? Are you extroverted? All of these can influence what rest actually means to you and how you do it. The second, work when you work, rest when you rest. So part of the power of keeping a rest day weekly is the way that it sections our lives. It's really, really clear when is the time to work and when is the time to rest. And you don't actually have to mix the two. And so I find this really helpful. When I'm in the middle of the week or getting towards the end of the week, I'm starting to lag a little bit. I feel like I want to take a nap. I feel like I want to procrastinate with the work I have. It actually helps me to remember that my rest day is coming in a day or two or three, and that I can push through right now because that time of rest is coming, and now is the time to work, and then it's the time to rest. Rest, fun, worship. This is the metric I use for deciding what gets to be a part of my rest day. Is it restful? Is it fun? Is it worshipful? And you have to know what these things are for you. But if it doesn't fit any of those three, it shouldn't be there. By the way, YouTube binging, not super restful, even though it can feel that way in the moment. Tell me if I'm wrong. Tell me you feel rested after a few hours of doing something, scrolling online. So the Sabbath, if you keep it, is actually a really good place to implement some guidelines around technology. A walk in the woods, a dinner with friends, a long afternoon nap. I do those, and I feel the gentleness and the lowliness of Jesus. Come and find rest for your souls. And then last, start small. You don't have to do 24 hours. You don't have to do any of it. I'm not your pastor. I don't live where you live. I can't actually make you do this. All I can give you is what I hope is a compelling picture. And if 24 hours, you want to give it a try, but 24 hours is too much, you can start with an evening a week, or you can start with half a day. You can start small. Don't despise the humble beginnings, and you can work your way up from there. Okay, so that's a brief overview of Sabbath in the scriptures.